中东那边，哈梅内伊遇刺，战火连天，全世界都在问中国怎么还不慌？中国不担心伊朗倒下吗？就在大家议论纷纷的时候，一位美国顶级地缘战略专家突然说出了一番让人醍醐灌顶的大实话。他不仅没说中国会输，反而断言美国在中东打得越凶，中国在亚洲就越安全。他说中国对伊朗根本没有感情，只有生意。他还说中国正在冷眼旁观美国把自己的航母、精力和国运一点点消耗在波斯湾的泥潭里。这到底是美国人的阴谋论，还是他们终于看懂了东方的智慧？别眨眼，阿欣带你听听这位美国专家是如何泄露天机的。
So, as the war between Israel, Iran, and the United States continues, there's something big being misunderstood right now. A lot of people are watching Iran and assuming Beijing must be, in some ways, really panicking because Iran has been one of China's most important partners in the Middle East, because Chinese refiners have absorbed sanctioned crude oil for years, and because this crisis is shaking the entire regional security, entire global energy and economic architecture. Now, the assumption goes like this. If Iran is weakened, China is weakened. Simple, right? But that assumption in some ways confuses symbolism with structure. You see, China's reaction is much colder than people might expect, even for someone or something as strategically significant as Iran. And it's much more revealing because of it. Because, from Beijing's perspective, there are two fundamentally different kinds of shocks. Firstly, one kind that is chaotic and contagious, but the other kind is brutal, but also manageable. And so China is actually far more afraid of that first one. And understanding that distinction explains almost everything. So in this video, I wanted to unpack three things. Why Beijing's reaction is restrained rather than alarmed, what China actually fears more than Western military force, and how this crisis could, counterintuitively, strengthen China's position in the broader US-China competition. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to this latest update and deep dive perspective on the situation between Israel, Iran, and the United States. Now, firstly, before continuing, I want your thoughts. Do you think China ultimately prefers stability at any price, even if it comes via American force? Or does it actually quietly benefit from the United States being dragged into this prolonged theatre? Because how you answer that question basically predicts how you think not merely this conflict will end, but how this entire decade. And so while the war in the Middle East continues to wage, with particular concerns over the impact on the Strait of Hormuz, oil supply, and overall global economy, there's another organizing idea that's worth considering. You see, China fears domestic contagion. Once you understand that lens, Beijing's behavior stops looking confused or nuanced and simply looks consistent. Now, aside from the ideological element or the military implications, you also have to layer in the more specific material incentives. China is the world's largest importer of crude oil. Roughly a fifth of global traded oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, a video you can find earlier on the channel I made. A choke point that sits directly off Iran's coast. So any threat to that waterway threatens price spikes, inflationary pressure, and economic instability inside China. One of the biggest debates across all of this already within 4 days is, of course, how much is this going to impact China, impact India? Beijing has already acknowledged that the fighting has touched China directly, including the reported death of a Chinese national in Tehran and the evacuation of thousands of citizens, workers in the country. That alone forces Beijing to respond publicly. So China condemns the strikes. It invokes that idea of sovereignty. It calls for restraint. Everything that you would expect it to do in its diplomatic posturing over the years, be it regarding American intervention elsewhere or over general conflicts in its near abroad. But as often in international relations, the key is in what it does not do. It does not mobilize militarily. It doesn't threaten retaliation. It does not escalate diplomatically to the point of rupture with Washington. Because Beijing's primary strategic relationship is still and always is usually the United States. Trade truce negotiations, technology control exports, semiconductor restrictions, Taiwan arm packages, summit diplomacy. Basically, for China, managing the US is structurally much more important than defending Iran. That is not emotional and it's not hierarchical. It's just pragmatism. And as you understand that, about the hierarchy especially, the reaction, of course, makes sense. China, as some people have said, operates in decades. It's a policy known as gradualism, and it's certainly not going to be a disruptor in the same way that some people in the West would call Iran or Russia as rogue states or pariah states. And why the idea that China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea are all part of this anti-Western bloc, I find rather simplistic. Because yes, you can talk about the Russians, the Chinese, the Russians and Iranians, and North Koreans, but putting the Chinese in that same bloc is just not accurate. They still benefit from the system as it is. And well, I cannot see the Americans labeling China a state sponsor of terrorism. There's also another crucial distinction. China's external relationships are strategic partnerships. They're not military alliances. I alluded to that just now, but the US has treated obligations across Eurasia and Europe strongly, at least, well, prior to Trump. China doesn't and hasn't operated in that way. Its relationships with Iran and Venezuela are primarily transactional, economic, diplomatic, yes, but not defense guarantees. So when China supports a partner, that usually means purchasing energy, providing diplomatic cover at the UN, selling surveillance technology or dual-use equipment, offering infrastructure financing. This does not mean committing troops. It does not mean absorbing military risk, as the US does with all its bases around the world. And so this is why expectations that China would, quote, step in, misunderstand Beijing's basic operating model. China, in essence, benefits from influence without responsibility, and it prefers leverage without entanglement. But why that is also been appealing to many countries, because they don't feel the obligations of, say, human rights or democracy or rule of law, as has come with American institutions, for example. Now, let's also address the hot take here. You will hear that Iran was a thorn in America's side. Therefore, weakening Iran weakens China. Now, two things can be true at once. Yes, Iran has been useful to Beijing. Iranian flows, even under sanctions, have helped fuel Chinese industry. Tehran has complicated US strategy in the region. A distracted America is not bad for China. But let's flip it upside down. Because if the US becomes operationally committed, if aircraft carriers, strike groups, intelligence, presidential attention are absorbed in the Middle East, that imposes opportunity costs. Military power is finite, even if it is America's. Presidential time is finite, and strategic focus is finite. So if Washington spends bandwidth too much in the Gulf, it has less to spend in the Indo-Pacific. That does not automatically mean China wins, but it does mean relative space opens up. And geopolitics is often about the relative advantage as much as the absolute. There's, of course, also structural asymmetry to this. Iran has relied heavily on China as a buyer of its crude exports. Under sanctions, a vast share of Iran oil has ultimately found its way to China's refineries, often relabeled, rerouted through intermediaries, or blended into other grades. So that means Tehran needs Beijing much more than Beijing needs it. China, by contrast, can diversify Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iraq, UAE. Iran matters to China, but it's not irreplaceable. And it's that asymmetry that gives Beijing much more room to be unsentimental. It just needs someone who can guarantee stable flows, manageable prices, and predictable commercial conditions. If those conditions can be preserved under any form of the remaining regime or something completely different, Beijing will be fine. And it is cold, but it is completely consistent with what I've said countless times and just what makes sense from a realpolitik standpoint. With all of this in mind, now zoom out. Look at the big picture, as we do on the Global Gambit. China has major investments and expatriate populations in the Emirates, in Saudi Arabia, and they are, strategically speaking, still closer aligned with Washington. So Beijing's Middle East posture has always been more balanced than simply China backing Iran against the West. China wants, as we say, stable energy prices, safe investment environments, access to infrastructure and telecom contracts, smooth shipping lanes. It does not want regional fragmentation, Hormuz disruptions, missile exchanges spilling into the Gulf energy infrastructure, or a nuclear arms race anywhere, let alone in the Middle East. And there leads an overlooked point. Chinese officials have long been quietly uneasy about the possibility of Iran developing nuclear weapons, not because Beijing shares Washington's ideological objectives, but because nuclear proliferation weakens the taboo constraining rivals closer to home, namely Japan or South Korea, that feel they may need it with the growing, as they see, belligerency by Beijing over territorial interests and especially Taiwan. So a Middle East nuclear breakout would have ripple effects in Japan, South Africa, and beyond. And that's definitely not in China's interest. So paradoxically, if this crisis were to produce a more constrained Iranian nuclear posture, Beijing probably wouldn't view that outcome as negative. There's a reason it's always been a signatory to the JCPOA. But taking a step back and considering everything that we've looked at, how could this still benefit China? Well, let's lay out the compounding logic clearly. Firstly, the US military action increases instability across the Middle East. Second, instability requires sustained American attention and force posture. Thirdly, sustained attention drains resources and focus from Asia. 4, reduced focus creates relative operational space for China. 5th, China frames the US as a source of global instability. 6, that framing resonates, as always it usually does increasingly, across parts of the global south. And 7, diplomatic narratives reinforce China's positioning as a status quo power, a term and concept that some academics like to argue China is, not trying to topple the US system. This is a feedback loop. Even if Iran is weakened in the short term, the broader effect could still produce strategic breathing room for Beijing. And China does not need to win dramatically. It just needs the US to overreach, which in some people's views it is, and to remain stretched. And what that means is, and so that could determine how this plays out. In scenario 1, for example, the United States gets strategically bogged down. If operations continue to expand, commitments deepen, and American attention remains so locked in the Middle East, this is quietly tolerable and probably much more advantageous to Beijing. It doesn't mean China likes the chaos, it just means China prefers the United States paying the cost of managing and directing this chaos. The second scenario, of course, being that there is a rapid stabilization and reconfigured Iran. If the crisis were to quickly stabilize and a new political configuration emerges in Tehran, one that reduces nuclear risk and restores energy flows, China too would still adapt. It would show up commercially, it would invest in infrastructure, it would buy oil under these clearer conditions. Not much would really change. But scenario 3, regional fragmentation and energy shock, is the scenario that Beijing would genuinely fear the most. If Hormuz is increasingly disrupted, if price spikes dramatically go further and further, and the Gulf infrastructure is the sustained focal point, that directly harms China's economy. The core point is that China is condemning what it needs to condemn. It is evacuating who it needs to evacuate. It is issuing statements about sovereignty in restraint as a way to win diplomatic brownie points with the international community. But it is not reacting like a power that feels strategically wounded. It is reacting like a power that believes the larger contest with the United States is always the primary focus, and that the Middle East theatre is where American resources, reputation, anything else of that currency can be consumed. Beijing's calculus isn't emotional, it is always hierarchical. Domestic stability first, US competition and management second, Middle East partners third. And Iran matters, but it is certainly not at the top of that hierarchy, if anywhere at all. So the real question isn't whether Iran isn't weaker. The real question is whether this crisis shifts strategic momentum in the broader US-China competition. Let me know in the comments below what you guys think. Thanks for watching.
听完这位美国专家的分析，阿欣在茶水间里不得不说一句，这个美国人是个明白人。他看懂了中国战略中最核心的2个字，定力。大家发现没有？西方媒体总喜欢把中国描绘成一个处处都要插手的扩张者，好像伊朗一有事，中国就得派兵去救。但这位专家一针见血地指出了真相，中国不是美国，我们不搞军事同盟，我们不当世界警察。我们对伊朗有感情吗？有，但那是基于利益的战略伙伴，而不是要为之流血的盟友。在中国的战略棋盘上，等级分明，第一是国内的稳定和经济发展，第二是与美国的博弈，第三才是中东的朋友圈。所以，当美国把双航母派到中东，把 F-35用来炸得黑蓝的时候，中国在干什么？我们在搞建设，我们在造船，我们在东南亚做生意，我们在通过外交呼吁和平。这就是专家口中的机会成本。美国在中东投入的每一分精力，每一枚导弹，都是在削弱它在印太地区围堵中国的力量。它在波斯湾陷得越深，我们在家门口的压力就越小。这听起来很冷酷，但这才是大国博弈的底层逻辑。而且，中国之所以不慌，归根结底是因为我们有底气。以前我们怕石油断供，现在呢？我们有俄罗斯的管道，有沙特的订单，有新能源的布局。伊朗虽然重要，但已经不是那个能卡死我们脖子的唯一了。 这位美国专家说，中国希望美国去承担混乱的代价。这话虽糙，理不糙。美国既然喜欢当霸主，那就让他去当好了，让他去炸，让他去管，让他去背负那些沉重的战争债务和道德指责。而我们只需要站在历史正确的一边，站在和平与发展的一边，稳稳地走好自己的路。真正的赢家，从来不是那个打架最凶的人，而是那个等到最后站得最稳的人。美国人现在看懂了，但他们停不下来。这或许就是霸权的宿命。好了，今天茶水间的深度复盘就到这里。你觉得美国能从中东泥潭里拔出腿来吗？欢迎在评论区留下你的神预言。别忘了点赞、订阅阿星的茶水间，让我们一起看清这个世界的底牌。下期再见。